I will leave it over to Benno.
So, next up is a RACI presentation, so it's the RIPE academic program. And it's Dr. Richter on how I stopped worrying about, how I learned to stop worrying and love carrier-grade networks. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm Philipp Richter. I'm a PhD student at TU Berlin. This is my first RIPE meeting, so thanks so much for having me here. Today I will talk about carrier-grade NAT deployment in the internet. There's a corresponding paper which will appear at IMC in this year, and you can download it on this archive link here. This is joint work with a lot of people: Florian, Naseo, Mark, Randy, Anya, Christian, Nick, and Vern. Okay, where's this presenter thing? Oh, here. Okay. So I guess everybody in the room here is aware of the problem of IPv4 address exhaustion, so there's really no need for a long introduction here. 4 out of 5 registries exhausted their address pools, and today we have less than 2% of the globally routable IPv4 address space that's still free and usable. The question is, of course, what happens now and how can we track what is happening now? The obvious solution to the scarcity problem will, of course, be the transition over to IPv6. And in turn, there are lots of initiatives to promote IPv6 adoption, and there are also lots of measurements and statistics available so we can keep track of where we stand with IPv6 adoption. Now, another way is to buy IPv4 addresses from address markets, and there are address brokers promoting this, and also the areas publicize transfer statistics. So also here, we have at least some statistics available that we can keep track how these markets are evolving. But then there's the third thing, and that is that ISPs use IPv4 carrier-grade NAT to multiplex more users behind fewer public IP addresses. And if you look at carrier-grade NAT, we soon realize that virtually there are no deployment statistics available, so it's really hard to understand how popular this way of combating V4 exhaustion actually is. And also really little is known about how CGNATs are configured in the wild. And this will be the focus of this talk. And now, first, given that there is so little information available, we first wanted to know what ISPs have to say about it. So we also performed a survey, but I will just spend 2 minutes talking about it. So we asked ISPs about IPv4 scarcity and carrier-grade NAT deployment. We have a questionnaire that we sent over mailing lists, of course also including the RIPE mailing list, and eventually we received more than 75 replies from ISPs from all over the world. And what was probably the most important question that we asked is, did you or do you plan to deploy V4 carrier-grade NAT? And here we were really surprised that 38% of our respondents told us, yes, we already do deploy CGNAT for some or all of our subscribers. Another 12% told us, we don't have that yet, but we are in early trials and we consider deployment in the near future. Now, we found that number really high, and then we went on and asked some more CGN-specific questions. So we asked ISPs what the major operational concerns are when it comes to CGNAT deployment, and the most commonly mentioned thing was that subscribers might experience problems with applications that just don't work well behind the CGNAT. Online gaming was mentioned a couple of times. Secondly, the traceability of users behind CGNAT, and also issues with CGNAT gateway IP addresses getting blacklisted. We also asked ISPs what they see as major challenges, like when setting up and when configuring carrier-grade NATs. Many ISPs mentioned that troubleshooting connectivity issues is really a big problem here, but also more generally when configuring a CGN, how to do the resource allocation, like how to distribute IP addresses and ports to subscribers, and how to set the right quotas for the subscribers. And also, interestingly, I want to mention that here, because I will return to it later, 3 ISPs told us that their problem with CGNAT is that they've ran out of internal address space, meaning that they've used the available RFC 1918 ranges already for their management network, and now they need to find new ways to find internal IP addresses to assign to the subscribers. Okay, so we also gave this, the ISPs a free text comment field. I will just show some of the things that ISPs told us here, so that was quite illuminating. What we can say is that most ISPs were not really fond with deploying CGNAT, as you can see in the first quote, but also many ISPs told us that for them IPv6 adoption seems problematic, and so they prefer to sticking to IPv4 and eventually deploying CGNAT. Okay, so this survey really motivated us to go deeper and dig into this CGNet field. So it seems to be widely deployed, according to our survey, and also ISPs voiced concerns about CGN configuration. At the same time, we don't have broad and systematic studies available here. So our objectives were to develop methods that allow us to detect carrier-grade NAT in the internet, and also to develop methods that allow us to extract some properties of the CGNet deployments that we identify to finally illuminate what the current status of CGNet deployment in the internet is. Okay, before I start introducing our methods, I just want to quickly introduce some terminology. So here in this figure, you see how a typical scenario, like how a regular subscriber is connected to the internet. So you see the ISP in the center. The ISP has some public IPv4 address space and peers with other networks in the internet, as you can see on the right. Now, this ISP assigns a public IPv4 address for each subscriber, and then in turn, the subscriber runs a home net, a CPE net, to connect its various devices. So that is the typical case. Here we do not have a carrier-grade NAT. But now the ISP might want to deploy CGNet. We have an additional NAT box, which now sits in the ISP, and behind that CGNet box, the ISP now hands out internal IP addresses to its subscribers. And that gives us two more cases, and that is the case of NAT44 on the carrier side, which is shown in the center here in this figure. And this is the case where the devices of the subscriber are directly connected to the carrier-grade NAT. And this is a common scenario for cellular networks. And then we have the last case where the ISP hands out internal IP address space to the subscribers, and in turn the subscriber runs another home NAT. So here we have the situation of NAT444. Okay, now this is what the CGNet deployment looks like on the whiteboard. And now I will present you our two methods that we found to be effective to detect CGNet presence in the internet. The first method that we found is what we call detecting CGNet from the outside using BitTorrent. We call it from the outside because with this methodology, we do not need any probing devices within the ASs that we want to test. We can do that by crawling the BitTorrent DHT. Let me walk you through. So you all probably all know the classic BitTorrent setup. So if you want to download a torrent, then you would connect a tracker, and this tracker holds contact information for other peers, and then you can ask the tracker, please give me contact information because I want to download torrent XYZ. The tracker will reply to you, and then you can connect to these other peers and start leeching your content. But you can also do that without using a central tracker. You can do so by using the BitTorrent distributed hash table. So when you use the BitTorrent DHT, then each BitTorrent node on the internet will store a list of peers that it recently interacted with, and then if you want to download content, you can ask these peers directly and ask them to provide you with contact information of other BitTorrent peers. And it turns out that we can use these peers in the BitTorrent DHT as vantage points for our study. So what did we do? We implemented a BitTorrent DHT crawler, which is basically a machine that continuously asks BitTorrent peers across the internet and asks them to tell us contact information of other peers that they interact with. In turn, these peers reply us. So for example, this peer here tells us, I can reach peer XYZ, and then we also get the corresponding IP address and port that this peer can speak to. And now we have this crawler running, and after a while we realized that there are peers that tell us that they can reach other BitTorrent peers using private IP addresses. So for example, here we have this guy that sits obviously behind a NAT, and it tells us that it can reach another peer, in this case this peer 8A2D, which is also behind the same NAT, and it can reach this peer using an internal IP address. So basically this peer leaks us internal address space. And once we realized that this is happening, we tailored our crawler to extract as many of these private IP addresses from the DHT as possible, and we can do so quite efficiently. So within 1 week of crawling, we collect internal IP addresses collected from more than 700,000 peers in 5,000 networks. Now the question is, do all these 5,000 networks deploy carrier-grade NAT? Well, of course not, because at this point we just know that there's some form of NAT, but it could be a home NAT hosting multiple BitTorrent clients behind it, or it could be a carrier-grade NAT. And now to better understand this and to also be able to dissect between small home NATs and carrier-grade NATs, we have to have a closer look at the leakage relationships. And what we basically do here is that based on all the data that we collect with our crawler, we form a graph. So whenever we see a peer A that leaks us the contact information for a peer B with an internal IP address, we form two vertices in our graph, where the leaking peer, peer A, is a big blue vertex, and the private peer, the peer with the internal IP address, is the small red vertex. And then we draw an arrow to show, in this case, peer A leaked as peer B. Okay, and now we look at these leakage relationships on a larger scale. Namely, we form a graph for each AS in which we crawl peers. Now let me show you what this looks like. Now, for most ASs that we crawl, this graph looks like the one you see on the left-hand side. So we do see BitTorrent peers here that leak us internal IP addresses and internal peers, but we see that typically they only leak us one or two, a handful of them, and also that all these leakage relationships are isolated. So these are really very likely to be related to small HomeNet deployments. But then we see other ASs like the one on the right-hand side where the picture is really different. So in this AS, we see many peers leak as not just one or two, but tens or even hundreds of internal peers. And also, if you have a closer look, we also see intersections here, meaning that in this AS, we see different BitTorrent peers with different public IP addresses leaking us the same contact information. And that leads to the formation of huge clusters in some ASs. Okay, now that is a sketch of our BitTorrent methodology. With this methodology, we can test more than 2,700 ASs, and setting a very conservative threshold, we detect CGNet in more than 250. Now, the benefits of this methodology are that we have a really broad coverage, and that also we do not need any probing devices. So we can probe really remote ASs. The caveats are that in order for an AS to show up here, we need significant BitTorrent activity, which is not the case for all networks, of course. And secondly, we will not see all CGNets here. For a CGNet to pop up here, it needs to be configured in a very open way, namely in a way that the BitTorrent peers located behind the CGNet have the way to find each other, to learn the internal IP addresses of each other. And that is not possible in all CGNet setups. Lastly, it gives us only a limited visibility into cellular networks. All right, so we complemented that with a second approach, which is what we call from the inside, using Netalyzer. So we call this approach from the inside because here we have direct control over probing devices that are located within the ISP. Okay, let me quickly introduce Netalyzer. Maybe some of you know it. Netalyzer is a network troubleshooting suite. It is developed by IXI in Berkeley. You can download it as an Android app or as a Java applet or as a command line tool. And basically when you download this and execute it, it will run a lot of tests regarding your internet connection and will provide you with a detailed report on the health of your connection. At the same time, when running Netalyzer, you will support our research with that because we use this data for measurement studies. And in this study, we use data from more than 550,000 sessions. And a session just means that a person executed Netalyzer. And these sessions cover more than 1,500 ASs. Now, the benefits of the Netalyzer method is that here we have direct access to the device, router, IP address, and also the public IP address. And it also runs in cellular and non-cellular networks because we also have an Android version of that app. And of course, as we have full control over the client here, we can also implement more customized tests to learn more about CGNet behavior. Okay, now let me quickly sketch how we detect CGNet with Netalyzer. We have here two cases. We have the cellular network case. In this case, detection is relatively simple because we know that the device IP address is the address directly assigned by the ISP. So we can compare this one to the IP address that we see on the server side and can reason, okay, there's a carrier-grade NAT here. Now, in residential networks, the situation is a little more complicated because the device IP is always assigned from the home router. So what we do here is that we query the external IP address from the home router using UPnP and again compare it with the server-side IP. It turns out that this process actually is a little more complicated because in up to 7% of the sessions, we see that they are executed from home users that have multiple CPE devices in their homes, meaning that the external IP address of the first CPE device does not reveal anything about CGNet. But we developed several heuristics to remove such sessions. I can talk more about that later in case you're interested. Okay, to sum this up, with Netalyzer, we test another 1,500 ASs, and we detected CGNet in 194 non-cellular ASs and also in more than 200 cellular ASs. Now the benefits are clear. It gives us more control over our measurement point. The caveat is that this is a crowdsourced data set, so we are at the mercy of users executing NetAlyzer. All right, now having introduced our two methodologies, I will now present you some CGNet deployment statistics. Okay, so first, how many networks do we cover? We are primarily interested here in eyeball networks. So we are interested in ISPs that really connect end users to the internet. And so we first wanted to have a set of eyeball networks. And in order to get that, we rely on two data sources. So we rely on the Spamhaus PBL list, and we consider ASs that register address blocks in that list. And also we consider a data set provided by APNIC Labs that gives us an estimation of the subscriber population of ASs. So with that, we identify our eyeball AS population, which is 3,000 ASs. And if we look at how many ASs we cover with our two methods, we see that our coverage is relatively good with covering more than 60% of the eyeball ASs. And now the percentage of ASs, of eyeball ASs that we detected as CGN positive is here at 17.1%. Now, if you compare it to our survey, in our survey it was like 38%. There might be different reasons for that. So we set very conservative thresholds, so you can consider the 17% as a lower bound. The real number might be somewhere between 17 and 38. Okay, so this is for the non-cellular networks. In the cellular networks, we covered more than 200, and we see that CGN is just everywhere. So 94% of all cellular networks do deploy carrier-grade NAT. Okay, now this is the network-wide view. Now we wanted to see whether there are any regional characteristics. And for that, we used our AS population and we dissected it according to the RIR regions. Now the first bar plot on the left-hand side shows you our coverage, where we see that we don't have a strong regional bias, but we really cover networks from all the 5 regions. But what's more interesting is that in the second bar plot in the center, we show for each region the percentage of eyeball networks that are CGNet positive. And here we see that it's especially the APNIC and the right region that show the highest ratio of CGN deployment. So we speculate that this is because scarcity manifested first in these 2 regions, but I would also be really curious to hear your opinion on that. Okay. Now, our methods also allow us to study some properties of the identified CGNets, and I will present you some of them. So both our methods allow us to study the internal address ranges that the CGNets that we identified use. And what is shown here for all the instances of CGNet that we detected, both for the cellular as well as for the non-cellular case, we show you what internal address ranges we found to be in use here. And so here we see that the 10/8 address block is still the most commonly used, and that this relatively newly allocated 164 address block is still is not yet that popular. But what's probably more interesting to see here is that more than 20% of the ASs in which we see CGNet already use multiple internal ranges to satisfy the internal addressing demands of their subscribers. And now if we recall that also in this survey, 3 ISPs mentioned that this is an issue for them. Now this goes as far as that we see that for several major cellular networks that they seem to see the need to use routable IP address space as internal address space behind their CGNet deployment. And in this figure here, I show you 6 of the most prominent cases. So what we show here is on the x-axis, we show the corresponding routable address block, and then we draw a blue dot wherever we see an AS using that address block as internal address space behind their CGNet. Now, it's important to notice this is not about name shaming. We see this for more networks, but these 6 networks are simply those for which we have enough data to be confident in our reasoning. Well, and the important takeaway here is that these are blocks that seem to be unused. So, for example, if we have a closer look at the 25/8 address block, this is an address block that is currently mostly unrouted, but actually we see that it is in internal use by at least 4 major networks. So what will happen if somebody wants to start routing that address block is not entirely clear. So we expect that users of these major networks might have connectivity issues. So that might also be a consideration for address transfer markets. So before you buy an address block, you might want to check if it's already in internal use in other networks. Okay, so that was one of the most important findings regarding the properties. We did some more tests to extract more out of the CGNets. I just want to quickly sketch our methodology here. So what we do is whenever we execute NetAlyzer, we execute 10 subsequent TCP connections, and then by comparing internal and external IP addresses and port numbers, we can reason about how CGNets allocate IP addresses and ports to its subscribers. And for some of them, we can even estimate how many ports each subscriber receives. We also implemented a custom NAT test that uses TTL limited probes to create state in all nets on the path and then to expire it in some hops but to retain it in others, which basically gives us the possibility to pinpoint the location of nets and also, of course, of CGNets, and also to extract timeout values from nets. And lastly, we also implemented a stun test to compare what kind of NAT mappings commonly deployed CGNs use. And we can compare that to what typical CPE routers do. Okay, now this is our methodology. For the sake of time, I will just present you a high-level overview of the results. So using these methods, we found a stunning variety of configurations and setups. So we see that when comparing different ASs to each other, but we also see that within the same AS. So we see that different users in that AS experience very different NAT configurations. We see that the degree of resource sharing varies heavily across different CGNet deployments. The most extreme cases that we found were ISPs who assign 512 ports per customer, which allows to NAT 128 customers per IP address. This was the most extreme case that we found. And we also see that the NAT mappings used by deployed CGNs restrict your internet connectivity actually even more than what your current CPE router does. So meaning that with these tests, we see that CGNs really limit the resources that are available to the subscriber, and probably more importantly, that CGN means really different things for different users because it so heavily depends on how the respective ISP dimensions and configures its CGNet. All right, to sum this up, so we provide this first broad and systematic study on CGNet deployment. We found more than 500 instances of CGNet using our two detection methodologies. We find the deployment rate in the non-cellular networks to be about 17%, and we see it's all over the place for cellular networks. It is especially pronounced in the RIPE and APNIC region, and we also identified some CGNet issues, for example, the need of some ISPs to use even routable address space internally. Okay, well, CGN deployment has some implications. So we see that CGNet deployment is a popular way to combat IPv4 exhaustion. So it's a consideration for ISPs to apply this technology or to not apply it. It has direct implications on IP address reputation systems and also geolocation systems. But what we want to highlight more is that we've very clearly seen in our tests that the CGNet directly reduces just how much internet the subscriber receives, because we've seen that the degree of resource sharing is really totally different for different CGNets. So here we wanted to raise the question, what is an acceptable degree of resource sharing? So for example, having 512 ports, is that enough, or does a user need more than that? And we also wanted to cautiously raise the question, is there a need for more best practices on how to dimension a CGNet, or should there even be some form of regulation? So for example, if an ISP deploys carrier-grade NAT, shouldn't this ISP maybe have to tell me what resources I really receive as a subscriber of this ISP? Okay, and with that I conclude. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Philip. Any questions? Well, there on the back, the very back, yes. Please go ahead.
It's going? Test? Yeah, it works. My name is Philip, and I'm from NetAssist. I would like to ask you some questions from your research. That's a question about timeouts. What was the average timeout for UDP and TCP connection in different life states? I mean about half open connection like SYN wait or established connection and so on. And how much UDP connection usually live in CGN you found?
Okay, can you tell me where you sit, because I can't see you? Okay. Okay. So actually, we cannot reason directly about how many concurrent UDP connections we see in the CGNet. I mean, this is not something we can do with our methodology. But we tested CGNet UDP timeout, so we didn't do that for TCP here. And we see that for most CPE routers, the UDP timeout is 60 seconds. So that seems to be a really dominant setting here. And for CGNets, we see more variability, so we see everything down to 30 seconds for UDP. We didn't implement it yet for TCP, so I cannot comment on that.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chris. I saw in place things with
affiliation.
Pardon?
Name and affiliation, please.
Chris from DDWRT. I saw in the field many problems with CGNet and services like Microsoft Exchange because of this 60-second TCP timeout, because Exchange wants 15 minutes. And this really craps up Exchange services if you go over CGNet. And I also saw, and I want to know why this is happening and what maybe can be done against it, many problems transferring UDP packages. So we saw sometimes lots of packet loss, even if we want to transfer 15 kilobits per second with UDP. There's some 2-3 providers in Germany, Unity Media or Cable Germany. And so we saw lots of, even with low transfer rates, and even low package size, you see horrible timeouts. And do you have any information why this is happening, and maybe how to clutch these people to fix these problems?
Okay, so I don't know how to solve these problems, but I would assume that the packet loss is related to the carrier-grade NAT just expiring the state, expiring the mapping in the CGNet. That would be what I expect.
Okay, Marco.
Yes, Marco Rijp, NCC. I wonder, I know it's a bit out of scope from your research, but did you look at the correlation between IPv6 deployment and CGNs? How many of these CGN providers offer a way around?
Okay, yeah, this is something, I mean, we asked, in our survey we did that, and we see that it's of course not only IPv4 carrier-grade NAT, but it is also in use as a transition technology. We didn't do that in our measurements, and that's mainly because the BitTorrent IPv6 capabilities are really poor. So this vantage point, we can't use this vantage point for that. For NetAlyzer, we have some data, and we are checking into this.
Okay. No more questions?
Good.
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
My name is Talgat. You did a very wide and global research of CGN, sorry. And I am asking about, did you think about, do some researches in alternative technology for saving IPv4 addresses? It's Lisp, locator ID separator protocol.
Yes. We didn't check into that.
Yes?
Yeah, hi, Cooper Lees from Facebook. I probably should catch you after this, but I can tell you there's a lot of IPv6 capability in BitTorrent. We use it daily.
Okay.
Thank you. One final question. Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Philip. Next
So, this is a lightning talk now.
This is a lightning talk, yeah.
Wow. This will be
It's
cool.
exciting, yeah.
And it's Shane, right?
It's Shane also.
Our friend Shane.
And he's throwing some numbers at us.